says. My name is Sophia. I'm here with my co-host Kayla. How are you doing, Kayla?
I'm pretty good. How are you, Sofia?
I'm great. Excited to start a new month in October. We've gotten some really interesting data back, and I'm excited to dive into it with you. Today, we're going to talk about inflation primarily and different aspects of inflation. We have a survey that gets into the supply side, the demand side, and just consumers' reactions to inflation. So I'm really excited to break that down for our listeners because it's one of my favorite surveys that we do. But before we get into that, I just wanted to do a temperature check on inflation overall. We all know that inflation has been a big issue in the economy in the past couple of years, probably the most discussed and probably the hardest one that we've faced in recent years. So, where are we at today with inflation? We just got a PCE reading. PCE, for those that don't know, is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, although there's also CPI coming out next week, which we'll get into at the end of the episode. Stay tuned for a forecast. But where are we at today? What's the temperature with inflation, Kayla?
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I would say that the temperature for inflation is actually getting kind of close to normal. Maybe something like 72 degrees. You and I have said in the past 70 degrees is maybe what we think of as that sort of goal temperature. Not too hot, not too cold, in our opinions. And the Fed would define that as around 2%. As Sophia mentioned, their preferred measure, that was down to 2.2%. That really is not much above it. So it's taken a long time to get here. At least it's felt like a long time, a lot of drama. I would call out that the core component, which strips out some of the more volatile aspects like food and energy, the core component is still a bit hotter. And especially in CPI, you see that that's still above 3%, which is yeah, above what the Fed would hope for. A lot of that is being held up by housing, but non-housing services are also still, seeing some relatively strong price growth in some categories. What do you think, Sophia?
I agree. I don't know when we're going to see relief from housing, especially because the housing market, that's a whole topic we could talk for hours on, but that is facing a lot of idiosyncrasies right now, which is keeping it persistently high. Services, I think we'll start to see that coming down slowly. You know, we've seen wage growth slow down a bit, so that one we just have to be a little bit more patient with. I think, yeah, as you said, core CPI and PCE might be a little bit hotter than the Fed wants, but overall, having PCE, the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, be 2.2%, I think is pretty much at target. Something that we should all keep in mind is the target 2% doesn't mean exactly 2%. It doesn't mean below 2%. It means 2% on average, which is they say long term average. They don't even define long term. So I think it's more just hovering around or up above or below 2% is fine with them. So 2.2% is definitely close enough to claim victory on inflation.
Wow, Sophia declares victory. That's exciting. And yeah, I agree with you. 2.2. That's really close.
I
That's
declare
really close,
victory.
with of course risks remaining.
Yeah. Although we don't know where it goes from here. It can turn around. And I think this week with the port strikes, the geopolitical conflicts, the hurricanes is a good reminder that there are shocks that can appear at any moment and change our fate. So hopefully things keep chugging along the way they are, and then we can continue to claim victory, but we will see. But that brings me to our main topic today, which is our supply chains and inflation indexes. There are six of them, and we ask consumers every month about a variety of different categories, 20 plus categories that people buy frequently. And their purchasing behavior on them, what they did and didn't purchase, what they considered purchasing, and why they didn't purchase it. Can you give us some background? Because you and some of our other colleagues here at Morning Consult are inventor of these indexes. And so, what was the motivation behind them, and what do you think they bring to the table?
Yeah, so I think our whole team really loves these indexes because they are very unique. And what we tried to do here was really kind of take advantage of that uh, wonderful luxury we have at Morning Consult of being able to ask consumers directly about, their life experience, what they're doing, what they're buying, what they're considering buying. That direct contact with consumers through surveys. And so, because what you can basically, the idea was we wanted to track purchasing considerations and outcomes, because what you can see and you hear about anecdotally is things like, oh, consumers are price sensitive, consumers are facing shortages, consumers are trading down. You'll see that anecdotally in earnings reports, but it's very, very difficult to quantify. I don't know of any place really that those behaviors are quantified, because in many cases it has to do with lost demand. And the only tool that businesses have to measure consumer demand really is the visible purchases, the ones that actually do happen. They don't really have a way of tracking the ones that didn't happen. And so because we're able to implement these surveys among consumers, we can ask them about these purchases that didn't happen and try to isolate why those didn't happen. Whether it was due to prices being too high, so they were price sensitive, or was it because there was a shortage and they weren't available. Alternatively, when they do make a purchase, was that the original purchase they considered, or did they have to trade down in order to get something more affordable? So that's kind of the unique thing that we're trying to track here with our framework.
You really hit the nail on the head with what is unique about it is being able to track what people didn't purchase because, or what people wanted to or considered to purchase and then didn't, because we have all kinds of measures for what people did buy. And especially these big companies in their earning reports, they know the customers what they did buy and how much money they made in the past quarter, but they don't know what they lost out on if they did have supply chain issues, and they don't know what they lost out on based on prices. So they can kind of estimate those things, but we can actually ask people directly and track that over time. And so that's been really fun to see unfold over the past couple of years, especially as we faced a variety of different supply and demand pressures from prices, from supply shocks, and just everything that's happened with inflation over the past couple of years. So, our indexes, we have a supply side and we have a demand side. And then we also have price surprise, which is special. That one's just measuring reaction to prices. But let's start with our demand indexes. My favorite one, I think, is price sensitivity. So, price sensitivity it takes the difference between the share of consumers who walked away when they faced a price that was higher than expected versus those who decided to purchase it anyway. So when price sensitivity is higher, that means a higher share of consumers are walking away and deciding not to purchase it. They're more price sensitive, they have more sticker shock. Um, so they're in a way, maybe they have less demand than if price sensitivity was lower, because if price sensitivity was negative or low, that means more people are deciding to go ahead and purchase it even when the price is higher than expected. So, what have we seen unfold with price sensitivity since we began tracking in 2022?
And I also love price sensitivity. And this one kind of represents a total loss of purchase. If they're walking away, they looked at the price and they didn't buy it at all. They didn't trade down, they just walked away. Just to differentiate between another index we'll get to in a second. And so, one thing that's interesting about this, just stepping away from the trend, first of all, it varies a lot by category. And Sofia mentioned we track this for 20 plus different categories. And then we aggregate them up to get sort of an overall level of price sensitivity. But it varies a lot by category, and you can imagine why. Something like groceries or gas essentials are going to have much lower price sensitivity scores than something like airfares or vacations, things that you maybe are like, oh, that would be nice. Oh no. Or something like a car, where maybe you're thinking about getting a car, but you see the prices and yours hasn't actually broken down. It's just getting old. So you just put off that purchase a little bit longer, waiting for prices to fall. So that's one thing to keep in mind with price sensitive that I think is important for interpreting it. Then getting to the trend, what's interesting, and I think it's great that Sofia pointed out the calculation here, because we've kind of continued to see an upward trend in price sensitivity, even as inflation is slowing. And what a lot of that is actually being driven by is that subtracted part. So what it seems like to me is it's not so much the trend is going up, but what's driving that and why that still qualifies as more price sensitivity, it isn't necessarily, I think, that people are walking away more often and more frequently having sticker shock. It's more that because price levels are so high, the people are, it's kind of maybe staying more stable, the amount of people walking away, but the number who are absorbing higher prices than expected has been going down as inflation goes down, if that makes sense.
And I think another way that I think about it is because the price level is so much higher now, inflation's cooled, but the price level is much higher. And I think anything that's higher than expected now is really going to be a little bit too high for people. So if they're running into, uh, people have kind of started to deal with and get used to the prices that have come with inflation in the past few years. But I don't, anything above that is just a little bit too far, I think. And that's what we're seeing here with price sensitivity is anything that's bringing shock or surprise in the price world is just not worth buying. Whereas in 2022 and 2023, maybe there was a little bit more appetite to just deal with it. As people were a little bit more surprised by prices, more often surprised by prices, maybe they just either had to deal with it and buy it anyway, or they were they had a little bit more runway to do so.
Yeah, and we definitely saw that in 2023 when we actually did have sort of a downward trend in price sensitivity. It was going, up, up, up in 2022 as inflation was peaking, started to come down, and then in 2024 has been rising again. And we've seen
Yeah,
that in spending too, kind of like you described, just less appetite to absorb these prices.
exactly. And a lot of that price sensitivity, I think, came from the drop in price sensitivity came from a lot of our consumers who were spending a lot in 2023.
Hmm.
Um, Especially those higher income consumers, their price sensitivity jumps around a lot more as they just change their mind on what prices they're willing to deal with. But they're an interesting group to watch. Okay, so that brings us to our second demand index. It's a little bit different. It's our substitutability index, and the name is pretty intuitive. We also sometimes call it our trading down behavior, trading down index. It's basically a willingness to trade down to a cheaper substitute, or think of, deciding to buy the generic brand of Advil versus Advil, whatever brand. But the calculation is those who purchased a lower price alternative minus those who did not purchase the item that they were considering. And so it's a little bit different than price sensitivity, the trends we've seen, and it's a little bit less sensitive. There's less movement there. The numbers are a little bit lower. Can you describe to us the trend that we've seen in substitutability? And it's been kind of interesting how that's changed as inflation has cooled. It's not been as straightforward as price sensitivity.
Yeah, not straightforward is a great way of putting this. And I mentioned with the price sensitivity, that was, you can think of that as a total loss of the purchase. Like we're just not buying that. With the substitutability, it is a purchase, but it's a cheaper one than maybe had originally been considered. So it's sort of like a partial revenue loss or whatever for that category. And what's because of that dynamic of it's still a purchase, but it's less than it would have been otherwise. I think that's kind of what part of what leads to this not straightforward path. Because we did see an interesting trend. And initially, in 2022, things were pretty clear cut for both price sensitivity and substitutability. We were seeing, and this is when inflation was peaking, to remind those who don't have a CPI chart in front of them. In 2022, prices were just going up, up, up very rapidly. Both of these indexes were rising, and that was kind of what you'd expect. Consumers are responding to these prices by limiting their spending, either by not buying something, or if it's something they kind of need, they really need, maybe they'll trade down and still spend, but the cheapest thing they can find. What was interesting is that even as price sensitivity was rising, we saw substitutability start to come down, and what we attributed that to was actually prices had kind of reached a point where there were fewer options to trade down to. It just wasn't an option for people really. That's what it seemed like because
Yeah. At a certain
yeah.
point, if you've traded down to a generic brand or you've decided to shop at a lower cost grocery store, there's not another cheaper brand or another
Yeah.
lower cost grocery store. You kind of at some point hit a wall.
Right. Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and at some point that becomes your norm. Like you're not trading down anymore. You're staying at that store. Maybe you used to shop at Whole Foods, now you're at Walmart because you
Hmm.
can't stand these grocery prices. But, the next month, let's say you shop at Walmart the first month, that's a trade down. The next month, if you go back, that's now your grocery store. It's not a trade down. Yeah, like you said.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, that's been kind of interesting how we've seen price sensitivity and substitution diverge at certain times in their trajectories. More recently, though, substitutability trading down has been going up a bit more, and that has corresponded with actually prices falling for some goods categories and certainly inflation slowing. So it seems like the pendulum is maybe swinging back a little. There now are options. I mean, we heard about all these sales over the summer. There's sales all the time, it seems like. And those are opportunities to trade down, and it seems like these price sensitive consumers are taking those options when they can.
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. And then another thing I wanted to point out that you mentioned it's not a total loss, like price sensitivity. For depending on the brand, higher substitutability could also be a gain. So it really depends on what brand you are, what company you are, what what consumers you're trying to capture. Because for some, more substitutability could mean good for your company, and for others, that could be a bad thing if you're kind of trying to target a more luxury brand or a more luxury consumer. So
Yeah,
it's
that's a great
definitely
point. Dollar stores and stuff suddenly were reporting having all these high income adults coming in. At the same time, we were seeing substitution increasing among those groups. So
exactly.
that's a good
So
point.
yeah, it takes a little bit more thought to think about, but it's also super interesting and provides a fuller picture of what consumers are doing because sometimes they don't want to give up on the purchase. They just want to find the best deal,
Yeah.
especially for necessities. Okay, so those are our demand indexes. Our supply indexes, they have been a little less interesting as of late as supply chains have eased up since their blockages early on in the pandemic. But you never know when that can turn around, as we saw in the past couple of weeks with all of the headwinds to supply with the hurricane, the port strike. You really never know when you're going to get a supply shock and those things might show up again. But let's talk about our supply chain side of the indexes. I would like to start with delivery delays, if you don't
Okay.
mind. I think delivery delays is the most straightforward.
Yeah.
So, do you want to talk us through what delivery delays is?
Yeah. So one difference between this one and the demand indexes we just discussed, we asked this one about fewer categories because this is really looking at, whether shipments took a longer time to arrive. So
Yep.
it's
So
really
this
more
is good.
limited to, yeah, physical goods and typically ones that could be purchased online, have the option to be purchased for delivery in some sense.
Yeah.
And this
Delivery
was
delays
really,
is for online goods, to be
yeah,
clear.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so online goods that you've ordered, how long are they taking to arrive? So this I would say is I guess it depends on the category, but this really covers that last mile delivery. Or it could be something like there's an actual delay on parts for furniture and it takes months and months. As anyone who maybe ordered furniture during in 2021, for example, if you tried to order a couch, I think I did. It took a really long time. And yeah, as Sophia said, though, we started these indexes we sort of started testing them in late 2021 when supply snarls were pretty intense, released them in early 2022. And so we had more delivery delays then. It really kind of dropped off and stayed flat starting in when did it start staying flat? Maybe like early
2023.
2023. Yeah. So it's been down and
Hmm.
yeah, so I'm curious to see if the hurricanes, I don't know that the port strikes did enough that it lasted long enough. It was so quick.
Yeah.
Um, but the hurricanes, I'd be curious because we can look at this at a regional level as well if we see some impacts in October.
Yeah, we might see a tiny blip in September or October, but yeah, I don't think it will change the trend materially since it was so short. Although, yeah, regionally it might be interesting to see how something like the hurricane affects it. That was a great explanation. Thank you so much. So I think that one's pretty straightforward. Then another one that's straightforward is purchasing difficulty. And that trend has been different, which we'll get into. But purchasing difficulty is supposed to capture the extent to which buyers experience difficulty obtaining a product or service. So basically, it takes a share of those who reported difficulty finding certain items minus those who did not report difficulty finding certain items. So think about when you went to the store during the pandemic and you couldn't find toilet paper, that would be captured in purchasing difficulty, just being unable to find the product. And that trend has been different than delivery delays in that it just keeps going down, down, down as our supply chains issues continue to clear up and our economy keeps chugging along. And so that was just pretty straightforward. Do you have anything else to add, or do we want to maybe contrast it with unavailability?
One thing on purchasing difficulty, then
Yeah.
I think let's describe unavailability and then we'll compare the two because there are some important distinctions here. I guess the one thing I would say with this one, it is also a more limited list than the two
Mhm.
demand ones and also unavailability that we'll get to in a second, but it does include housing.
Mhm.
So it's more than delivery delays because it has, anything that you can have shortages of. And I think some of that trend that we've seen may be related to housing in some way
Mhm.
and inventory with, say, rental apartments that maybe has been, yeah, I'm not ready to say that owned homes are becoming more plentiful yet. We'll see with interest rates, but
Well,
there
they
has
are
been
little. There has been an uptick on what has been on the market. So little.
coming off some very low.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't call it plentiful, but better than
Yeah.
before.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a little boost there, but yeah,
Mhm.
let's get to unavailability and then compare these two because that's a question we get a lot.
Okay, so can you walk us through what unavailability is very similar to purchasing difficulty, but how is the calculation slightly different and why is it different?
So the important thing to keep in mind here, so with purchasing difficulty, as Sophia described the question, we just say, did you have difficulty obtaining these products? And it's kind of left at that. It's its own question. With unavailability, the way that that question is asked, it's part of the same framework as our price sensitivity and substitutability. So the key there is that it's really tracking. It's a mutually exclusive group with price. So because the way the framework goes is did you buy it or not? And then if you didn't buy it, was it because it was unavailable or was it because of price or some other reason? So the if price is the dominant factor, that would take away from the share that are answering unavailability. That's kind of just in the way it's calculated. With purchasing difficulty, we don't
Consider price.
yeah, we don't consider price. We don't specifically rule that out. And I think I brought up the housing example. I think with housing and cars, the ones that involve financing, cost is a key factor there. And obtaining financing, that's not the same as it being unavailable, but it could be, an obstacle, a purchasing difficulty in obtaining it. Whereas in unavailability, if you're trying to buy a car, for example, and you had one on the lot, you saw it, you wanted it, but you couldn't get financing or something, or it was too expensive, so you couldn't buy it. That would maybe be price or cost as opposed to unavailability. So I think that's a big distinction. With some categories like groceries, more often it is going to be tracking pure shortages. I don't know. I can't think of other reasons that it was difficult to buy groceries really, but yeah.
Yeah. I think larger purchases are especially useful to think through the unavailability framework because, for example, when used car prices really shot up a couple years ago with a lot of the chip shortages, they fed into not just new cars being more expensive and harder to find, but also used cars. And so I think that's a good example because maybe your budget for a car is around $15,000, but you can't find anything below $20,000 on the market. So that would be captured in unavailability, but not in purchasing difficulty. Purchasing difficulty is more just, is it out there? Is the supply there? And
Yeah.
unavailability is more getting at the whole picture of were you able to find what you wanted at the right price?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think it's useful to have the two. It's also been just kind of trending downwards, but it does bounce around a little bit more, depending on what's going on with prices. So, yeah, those are our supply indexes. Thank you so much for walking us through them. Let's finish off with price surprise, which is also one of my favorites. So, price surprise is not a supply index or a demand index, but just gauging how consumers are feeling about prices, how they're gauging the price. So, amongst those who purchased a good, we ask those, was the price higher than expected when you purchased the good, or when you purchased it, was it at or below what you expected? We take the difference there. So a higher price surprise means a larger share of consumers thought the price was higher than they expected. And as anyone can guess, that has gone down over time as inflation has gone down. And it's very negative now, meaning that, we get this question a lot actually from our clients and people who use our indexes. They ask, why is price surprise negative? What does that mean? That means that there's, more people are purchasing things at a price that they expected, at or below what they thought it would be, which kind of makes sense. Do you want to walk through actually why it makes, in general, why people are buying things at prices where they expect?
Yeah. So what it has to do with a lot, and we've looked a lot at how price surprise links to inflation for the various categories. And through that, we've really seen that consumers set sort of a baseline expectation depending on how frequently they purchase the item. So if you think of something like groceries or gas, these are prices that you'll see come into contact with at least a couple times a week. Even maybe even if you're not buying gas, you'll see the sign. You see these prices often. So consumers have a very up to date expectation of what those prices are. So when those prices go up, the price surprise index is very sensitive to capturing that because consumers notice right away. With something like, again, the car example or home appliances, these big goods that you maybe only buy once every few years or even many years, the price expectations are most often set at the time when you bought it most recently. I mean, that can depend a little. Maybe you happen to see a price somewhere else. But if you're not actively going out considering purchasing these items frequently, it's more likely that you're not going to have that up to date of information on what it costs. So when you do finally go to that store and see the price, depending on how much it's gone up or down from whenever your long ago baseline was set, that will show up at sort of in a different way in the price surprise index. So it takes longer for certain prices to kind of resonate with consumers for these less frequently bought items.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, especially durable goods or things like that, we see kind of a more lagged effect on price surprise versus inflation because it takes a while for that to feed into the minds of consumers because everyone's not shopping for a car every day, or at least checking in with the, index for what prices are for
Yeah.
cars. So, yeah. And that actually really that ties in really well to our forecast because these are the considerations that you were thinking about when you created our CPI forecast because price surprise can tell us where inflation is heading. We've seen a really tight relationship with certain categories like groceries and gas, as you mentioned, because people are out buying groceries and gas every week at least. And then the other categories, while it might be a little bit lagged, it's still a useful indicator. And so, can you walk us through a little bit the design of the forecast and then maybe give us a teaser for what we think CPI is going to be this week based on what you found?
Sure. So the idea behind the Nowcast is, we were looking at price surprise and how certain categories especially correlated so well with inflation for those or price changes for those categories in the CPI. Um, and it depends on the category. Different ones have stronger relationships, but as I kind of was getting at before, if you look at lagged relationships and maybe a smoothed a moving average, certain ones relationships become apparent if you just sort of find the right one, and it kind of depends by the category what the baseline is. So yeah, as I said before, groceries and gas and restaurants are all in there with a pretty up to date time period, just flat in the model. Like consumers are, what are they reporting for price surprise? That just goes into the model. Some other categories that are in there, housing, durable goods, those have more lagged moving average relationships. But really, the idea here is consumers are going out and reporting what they're seeing in the market for prices. Shouldn't we be able to use that to track price changes? Because, assuming there's some accuracy there, and we definitely see a relationship there. It's been undershooting a little the past few months. I think consumers have maybe been so extra surprised, extra downward surprised by all the sales at the end of the summer. That's my theory. But anyway, so for the CPI, which will be coming out, I think, the day after we publish this podcast, so tomorrow, the Nowcast is projecting a 0.04 increase, so pretty much flat. And again, that's just very slightly below. I think consensus, at least as we're checking now, is like 0.1. The Cleveland Nowcast is like 0.1. So we're pretty close to consensus, just a hair lower, looking at pretty flat, very minimal inflation for September.
Yeah, that makes sense too, based on with everything we're seeing out there. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have anything else to add. This was a little bit of a longer discussion than normal, but I do think it will be useful and stand the test of time for those of you who keep up with our indexes and want to use them for your research or maybe for your brand. This, I hope, is a useful reference and will stand the test of time. Is there anything you want to add, Kayla, before we close this out?
No, I think that's a great closing. I mean, we love these indexes because they're so unique. This is my favorite data to get back, and the CPI is one of my favorite releases. I mean, the ones I'm most interested to see. So we love this topic. Always happy to answer more questions on this topic. But yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, and even though maybe inflation is going to become hopefully fading into the background a little bit more as an issue, and maybe each CPI release is less interesting to everybody, I think these indexes will still be interesting because we get an idea of how things are feeding into consumers and supply shocks can happen at any time and how will that affect like the holiday season or how maybe if there's more price sensitivity, sales would be really helpful to capture a larger share of consumers who might otherwise not participate in buying things in the holiday season or whatever shopping season. So yeah, I think the indexes are even interesting outside of an inflation framework. So
That's true. And they've only existed for a weird inflation time. They've only existed during elevated inflation. So I'm kind of excited to see what their baseline settles at, assuming,
mhm.
not jumping ahead, but, hopefully we kind of settle at a baseline. We see what's normal, and then we can understand even more about them and what changes mean.
And I wonder if price sensitivity will come down as inflation remains around 2% in the long
It
term.
has
We'll
to at
see.
some point.
Yeah, it will, and we'll see who it goes down for first. Probably those high income people.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kayla.
Thank
Um,
you.
I'll talk to you in a couple weeks, probably about labor.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Bye.
Bye.